A person's true value lies not in what others give or take away, but in their inner strength and resilience in rebuilding their life from the ashes. The air inside the mahogany-paneled office was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the sterile metallic tang of air conditioning. Ruth Sterling sat perfectly still in the high-backed leather chair, her spine as straight as a cedar fence post. Her hands, mapped with the blue veins and deep creases of 73 years of life, rested quietly in her lap. They were the hands of a woman who had spent 45 years pulling weeds, kneading dough, scrubbing floors, and tending to a husband who had finally succumbed to the quiet call of the earth. Across the wide, polished desk, Thaddeus, the elderly lawyer with spectacles perched on the tip of his nose, cleared his throat. The sound was like dry leaves skittering across a driveway. Desmond and Priscilla sat to her left, vibrating with an energy that felt like a predator sensing a kill. Desmond, at 50 years old, wore a suit that cost more than Ruth's first house, his fingers drumming a restless, greedy rhythm on his knee. Priscilla, 3 years his junior, adjusted her heavy gold bracelets with a sharp metallic clink. They were not her children by blood, but she had raised them since they were small, messy, and frightened. Now they were merely cold. They were strangers. The silence stretched. It was deafening. Under the terms of the final settlement, Thaddeus began, his voice gravelly and slow, we are finalizing the distribution of the liquid assets and the real property. Desmond leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a hard, flat light. He didn't look at Ruth, he looked at the paper. He saw the numbers as his birthright, a reward for a life he hadn't built. Thaddeus read the figures with a clinical detachment that made Ruth's chest tighten, though her face remained a mask of weathered stone. To Desmond, the lawyer stated, the primary savings account totaling $47,000 and the silver Ford F-150 pickup truck. Desmond let out a sharp, jagged breath of triumph. He adjusted his silk tie, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. To Priscilla, Thaddeus continued, the investment portfolio valued at $62,000, along with the entirety of the jewelry collection, including the diamond brooch and the pearl sets. Priscilla's hand went instinctively to her throat. She smiled a thin, cruel smile that didn't reach her eyes. That seems only fair, Priscilla murmured, her voice dripping with a false, honeyed sweetness. After all, we have lifestyles to maintain. Father would have wanted us to be secure. Ruth said nothing. She didn't scream, she didn't beg. She simply watched the ghosts of her 45 years of service being auctioned off to the highest bidder of greed. She had given this family everything. She had mended their clothes, wiped their tears, and kept the hearth burning through the coldest Tennessee winters. She had expected a crumb. She was receiving a stone. And for Mrs. Sterling? Ruth asked quietly. Her voice was steady. It was the sound of a calm river. Desmond laughed, a harsh, barking sound that echoed off the leather-bound books on the shelves. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small yellowed slip of paper. He flicked it across the desk toward Ruth. It fluttered like a dying moth before landing in front of her. We found this in the back of the safe, Desmond said, his tone mocking and sharp. A little souvenir from Father's tax auction hobby back in the late 90s. It is a plot of land at number 22 Dust Mill Road, out in the middle of nowhere in Harlan County. Thaddeus peered over his glasses at the document. He looked at Ruth with a flicker of something that might have been pity, or perhaps just exhaustion. It is a derelict property, Ruth, Thaddeus said softly. The records show it was purchased at a tax sale for exactly $9. It has been abandoned for decades. The county has already issued a pending demolition order on the structure. It is, for all intents and purposes, a liability. Priscilla leaned in, her eyes narrowed like a hawk's. "It's perfect for you, Ruth," Priscilla sneered. "A piece of junk for someone who has spent her life playing in the dirt. You can go out there and live among the ruins. It's more than you deserve, considering you were just a glorified housekeeper in the end." The words cut deeper than a winter frost. The room went cold. Ruth looked at the paper. $9. 45 years of her life summarized by a $9 piece of trash that the government wanted to bulldoze into the red clay. She thought of the $47,000 Desmond was already mentally spending on a new boat. She thought of the $62,000 in stocks Priscilla would use to fund her vanity. They had taken the meat and left her the bleached, brittle bone. She reached out. Her fingers touched the paper. "Is this the entirety of my inheritance?" Ruth asked quietly. "Every cent," Desmond snapped, "unless you want to argue in court for the next 5 years. We have the better lawyers, Ruth. You have $214 in your checking account. Take the $9 farm and get out." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, rusted iron key. It was long and primitive, the kind of key that belonged to a different century. He dropped it on the mahogany desk with a dull, heavy thud. The sound seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "The keys to your kingdom," he mocked. Ruth picked up the key. It was cold. It was shockingly heavy, its surface pitted with age and coated in a fine layer of orange rust. It felt like a weight, but also like a weapon. She didn't look at the money. She didn't look at the children she had raised who now viewed her as an inconvenience to be discarded. She stood up slowly, her knees popping with the familiar ache of labor. "I accept," she said. She didn't look back. She walked out of the office, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic pattern on the marble floor. She walked past the receptionist who wouldn't meet her eye. She walked out into the humid, heavy air of the Tennessee afternoon. Behind her, she could hear the muffled sounds of Desmond and Priscilla laughing. They were celebrating their victory. They were celebrating the fact that they had successfully pushed an old woman into a grave of rot and ruins. Ruth walked toward her old, battered 2009 Honda Civic. She sat in the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She didn't cry. Tears were for the weak, and Ruth Sterling had been forged in the fires of necessity. She looked at the rusted iron key resting in her palm. It felt a strange electric tingle in her fingertips. It was a sign. Holding the cold iron key to the $9 ruin, Ruth had no idea that the place those greedy fools had just mocked was actually a tomb, a hidden vault for a secret that would soon shake the very ground beneath their feet.
The descent was swift, brutal, and utterly silent. Ruth Sterling was effectively exiled from the only life she had known, cast out with nothing but a battered 2009 Honda Civic and a bank balance of exactly $214. For 6 agonizing weeks, that compact car became her entire world. She slept in the cramped driver's seat. She woke every morning with a sharp, stabbing ache in her lower back. She washed her face in the freezing water of harsh, fluorescent-lit gas station sinks, eating dry, flavorless crackers and drinking tepid tap water while the world outside rushed by, utterly oblivious to the dignity she fought so desperately to maintain. The nights were the hardest. Temperatures frequently dropped to a bitter 42 degrees Fahrenheit. She huddled under a single, moth-eaten wool blanket, listening to the heavy rumble of passing 18-wheelers and the distant wail of police sirens. She thought of Desmond and Priscilla, no doubt sleeping on imported silk sheets in temperature-controlled rooms, their bank accounts swelling with the thousands of dollars that were supposed to secure her final years. Yet Ruth did not shed a single tear. Crying was a useless luxury for those who still had a safety net, and Ruth possessed nothing but the iron will forged over 73 years of unyielding Stoic endurance. When her gas gauge dipped dangerously close to the red line, she knew it was time to face the inheritance they had mocked her with. She drove 35 miles east into the deep forgotten heart of Harlan County. The smoothly paved highways slowly gave way to cracked asphalt, which eventually surrendered to a rutted, bone-jarring path of loose gravel and hard red clay. She drove for miles until the towering pine trees grew thick and ominous, until the GPS signal on her prepaid mobile phone completely vanished into thin air. She finally stopped at number 22 Dust Mill Road. The engine sputtered. It died in the silence. Ruth stepped out of the car, her worn leather boots sinking into a thick, tangled carpet of overgrown knee-high weeds that choked the front yard. The silence of the sprawling 2-acre property was absolute, heavy and thick with the suffocating smell of damp earth and rotting timber. Before her stood a structure that looked less like a house and more like the skeletal remains of some massive, defeated beast. It was a picture of absolute, devastating ruin. The wide wraparound porch sagged dangerously in the middle, its thick wooden floorboards warped and buckled like broken teeth. Above, a large section of the roof had been severely damaged by a long-forgotten fire, exposing blackened, charred wooden rafters to the unforgiving Tennessee sky. To the left of the sagging stairs, nailed haphazardly to a rotting cedar post, hung a faded yellow notice flapping weakly in the wind. The printed black letters were faded but clear. "No trespassing, pending demolition," she read aloud softly, her voice carrying a quiet resolve. She stood alone in the wilderness, an aging woman facing a monument to absolute neglect. Most would have turned back, crushed by the sheer scale of the disaster, but Ruth felt a strange, primal pulse of life stir within her chest. This was not just a $9 derelict property. It was the only place on earth that belonged entirely to her. She reached deep into her coat pocket. Her fingers brushed the cold, pitted metal. She pulled out the heavy, rusted iron key. She walked up the creaking, groaning wooden steps, carefully testing each board with her weight before committing to the next step. She stopped in front of the heavy front door, its paint peeling off in long, curled strips that resembled dead skin. The keyhole was choked with decades of hardened dirt and rust. "Let us see," Ruth spoke calmly. She slid the key into the mechanism. It resisted at first, scraping harshly against the interior, fighting her with the stubbornness of a neglected century. She gripped the metal handle with both hands, planting her feet firmly onto the porch, and applied a steady, unyielding pressure. She twisted it hard. The iron lock gave way. It broke open with a sharp, crisp snap that echoed loudly through the empty yard. Ruth pushed the heavy oak door open, wincing as the iron hinges screamed in a loud metallic protest. She stepped over the rotting threshold, instantly hit by a dense, suffocating wall of musty air, decaying wood, and ancient dust. Her sharp, 73-year-old eyes swept slowly across the gloomy, debris-filled hallway, adjusting to the heavy shadows. She froze. There, amidst the overwhelming decay and the thick layers of ruin, her gaze locked onto a singular, impossible anomaly etched deep in the plaster of the far wall. The beam of her heavy plastic flashlight sliced through the oppressive gloom. It illuminated a world buried under decades of absolute, undisturbed neglect. The floor was an ocean of pulverized plaster dust, dead brown oak leaves that had blown through shattered window panes, and jagged shards of glass that sparkled like cruel diamonds in the artificial light. Most people would have seen a nightmare of filth and rot. Ruth saw a challenge. She breathed in the heavy, stale air. Instead of crumbling into despair at the overwhelming magnitude of the ruin, Ruth began a slow, meticulous calculation of the physical space. Her eyes moved past the peeling wallpaper, past the crumbling lath, exposed like broken ribs, and focused entirely on the enduring skeleton of the house. She walked softly across the debris-filled parlor, letting her experienced hands glide over the cold, rough surfaces of the damaged walls. She found a spot near the entryway where the floorboards had completely rotted away, exposing the dark, damp earth beneath the house. She knelt down to inspect it. Her fingers brushed the cold stone. It was a foundation built entirely of massive, hand-hewn limestone blocks. They were stacked with an incredible, uncompromising precision that had not shifted a single inch in over a century of freezing winters and sweltering summers. The modern, cheaply built mansions Desmond and Priscilla favored would have crumbled into dust under such severe neglect. But this foundation was a fortress rooted deep within the red Tennessee clay. Ruth stood back up, brushing the dirt from her knees, and pointed her flashlight toward the ceiling. The beam traveled up, cutting through the thick darkness, revealing a height that was practically unheard of in rural farmhouses of that era. 10 feet high. It was a grand, sweeping architectural choice that spoke of a builder who possessed both immense wealth and extraordinary, uncompromising vision. The ceiling joists, though black with age and coated in thick, heavy cobwebs, were thick beams of solid, old-growth timber. They were straight, true, and utterly unyielding against the immense weight of the sagging roof above. She moved slowly toward the center of the house, navigating the rubble with the careful, deliberate steps of a woman who knew the value of caution. Here, the shadow of the fire damage was most severe. The air smelled faintly of ancient charcoal, scorched earth, and bitter memories. The upper hallway was a cavern of blackened wood, yet rising majestically through the center of the devastation was a grand, sweeping staircase carved from thick, solid oak. The hungry flames had licked its edges, scarring the heavy newel post and blistering the smooth handrail, but the dense core of the wood had stubbornly refused to burn. Ruth placed her work-worn hand on the railing. She pushed down with all her might. The staircase did not groan. It did not sway. It stood as rigid and defiant as the aging woman who now claimed it as her own. A deep, quiet sense of respect washed over Ruth, settling into her tired bones like a warm drink on a freezing night. This house was a fierce survivor, brutalized by time and fire and human apathy, yet refusing to collapse into the dirt. "You and I are exactly the same," she whispered into the darkness, her voice steady, calm, and laced with iron. As the sun dipped below the tree line, plunging the ruined estate into a deep, impenetrable blackness, Ruth made her way to the rear of the property. She found what used to be the kitchen, a massive, echoing room dominated by a colossal, soot-stained brick fireplace that took up nearly an entire wall. Using a broken, jagged pine branch she had dragged in from the overgrown yard, she systematically swept away the thick layers of dirt, animal droppings, and broken ceramic tiles from a small 6-foot square section of the floor. She worked in absolute silence. Her muscles ached terribly. She gathered the driest pieces of broken wood, old newspapers she found stuffed into a wall cavity for insulation, and a handful of dry brown pine needles. With a cheap plastic lighter from her coat pocket, she coaxed a small, flickering flame into existence within the cavernous stone hearth. The fire crackled to life, casting long, dancing orange shadows across the ruined walls and pushing back the bitter, damp cold of the spring evening. Ruth did not return to the cramped, miserable confines of her car. She retrieved her thin wool blanket, laid it out carefully over the hard, unswept floorboards, and sat down cross-legged before the warming fire. She took a slow sip of water from a plastic bottle, chewing methodically on a piece of dry, stale bread. She was completely alone, miles from civilization, sitting in the middle of a condemned structure that the modern world had thrown away as garbage. She felt a profound, overwhelming peace. She knew this skeleton was a forgotten masterpiece, a hidden titan of limestone and oak that had been waiting patiently for decades for someone to recognize its true worth. But to resurrect it with only $214 to her name and a pair of exhausted, aging hands, Ruth prepared to step into the most grueling, unforgiving hard labor of her entire life.
Dawn broke over Harlan County with a cold, unforgiving gray light that bled slowly through the towering canopy of old-growth pine trees. The morning air was sharp and biting, hovering somewhere around 38 degrees Fahrenheit, leaving a thin, glittering layer of frost across the overgrown weeds of the front yard. Ruth Sterling woke on the hard floorboards of the kitchen, her bones protesting with a deep, hollow ache that radiated from her lower back down to her knees. She did not linger under the thin wool blanket. She did not allow herself the luxury of a slow morning, nor did she waste a single breath mourning the soft mattress and the climate-controlled bedroom she had been violently expelled from. She had work to do. Her bank account held exactly $214, a sum so pitifully small that Desmond and Priscilla would have spent it on a single bottle of imported wine without a second thought. But to Ruth, those $214 were a strict, uncompromising budget for survival. Every penny had to be stretched, squeezed, and utilized with brutal efficiency. She laced up her worn leather boots, tying the frayed laces with stiff, swollen fingers, and stepped out onto the sagging, dangerous boards of the front porch. The structure groaned under her weight, swaying slightly on its rotted pillars. The porch was the most critical failure point, threatening to collapse entirely and pull the front facade of the house down into the red dirt. She needed lumber. She walked 100 yards behind the main house, wading through a dense, tangled thicket of briars and sharp brambles that tore at her heavy canvas trousers. At the edge of the property line, half swallowed by the encroaching forest, lay the collapsed ruins of an old timber-framed storage shed. The roof had caved in decades ago, but the thick, load-bearing beams supporting the walls remained intact, crafted from dense, heavy heart pine that had hardened to the consistency of solid iron over the passing century. Ruth approached the ruins with a crowbar in her right hand, her eyes scanning the chaotic pile of gray, weathered wood for the straightest, strongest lengths. It was agonizing, back-breaking work. She wedged the heavy iron crowbar under a 12-foot length of heavy pine, throwing her entire body weight against the tool, grunting softly as the rusted iron nails screamed in protest before finally giving way. The beam easily weighed over 80 pounds, a massive, cumbersome burden for a woman of 73 years. She did not have a wheelbarrow, she did not have a tractor or a team of strong, young laborers to carry the load. She wrapped her calloused hands around the rough, splintered end of the beam, dug her boots deep into the soft, yielding earth, and began to drag it backward, inch by agonizing inch, across a distance of nearly 300 feet toward the main house. The rough bark tore at her skin. Her muscles burned with a fierce, blinding intensity. She dragged the first beam across the yard, her breath pluming in the cold morning air, her face set in a mask of absolute, unwavering determination. She returned to the collapsed shed and dragged a second beam, then a third, and then a fourth, leaving a deep, raw trench in the overgrown grass behind her. By the time the sun reached its highest point in the sky, raising the temperature to a mild 65 degrees Fahrenheit, Ruth's hands were raw, blistered, and weeping small drops of blood. She washed them in cold water pumped from an ancient rusted well handle in the yard, wrapped them tightly in torn strips of an old cotton shirt, and went right back to work.
Using a rusted handsaw she had found buried under a pile of debris, she spent 3 grueling hours cutting the salvaged pine beams down to precise 4-foot lengths. She wedged the new, sturdy timbers tightly under the buckling, compromised sections of the front porch, driving thick, heavy iron spikes through the wood with a massive sledgehammer she swung with slow, rhythmic precision. With every strike of the hammer, she drove the memory of Desmond's mocking laughter deeper into the earth, securing her foundation with a strength that was born of pure, unadulterated resilience. The porch slowly leveled out. It stopped groaning. Satisfied with the structural integrity of the entrance, Ruth turned her attention to the dark, suffocating gloom of the interior. The parlor windows were massive, measuring nearly 8 feet tall and 3 feet wide, designed to capture the cross breezes of the sweltering southern summers. The thick plywood covering them was waterlogged and incredibly heavy, held in place by dozens of stubborn, rusted screws that refused to turn. She worked systematically from room to room, using the claw of her hammer to violently pry the plywood away from the beautiful, historic wooden frames. As the first massive sheet of wood fell backwards onto the porch with a heavy, dusty thud, a brilliant shaft of golden afternoon sunlight pierced the gloom of the parlor, illuminating millions of tiny dust motes dancing lazily in the quiet air. She tore down the second board, and then the third. Light flooded the ruins. It was a small, silent victory, but to Ruth, it felt like she had just performed a miracle, breathing oxygen back into the crushed lungs of the suffocating, dying house. She stood in the center of the sunlit room, her chest heaving slightly, her clothes gray with thick layers of pulverized plaster and dirt, looking out over the overgrown yard. She was not alone. An old, faded blue pickup truck rattled slowly down the rutted gravel of Dust Mill Road, kicking up a long, lazy cloud of dry, red dust behind it. The truck came to a stop near the edge of the property line. The driver's side door creaked open, and a tall, painfully thin man with a weathered, deeply lined face stepped into the tall weeds. He wore faded denim overalls, a battered canvas work cap, and carried a thick leather tool belt slung casually over his narrow shoulder. His name was Tobias, a retired carpenter who had lived 3 miles down the road for the better part of 40 years, a man who had watched the old estate rot and decay with a quiet, helpless sorrow. Tobias walked up to the edge of the newly stabilized porch. He looked at the fresh pine beams. He looked at the heavy sledgehammer resting near Ruth's boots. He looked at the bloody, makeshift cotton bandages wrapped tightly around the hands of the 73-year-old woman standing before him. He did not ask her what she was doing. He did not offer useless, empty platitudes or unsolicited, patronizing advice about the dangers of manual labor for a woman of her advanced age. "The roof on the east side is entirely compromised," Tobias stated simply, his voice a low, raspy rumble that sounded like boots on heavy gravel. "There's a gap nearly 4 yards where the fire ate through the shingles." "I'm aware," Ruth replied calmly. "Rain is coming by Thursday, and if the water gets into those exposed oak joists, the whole upper floor will rot through in a matter of weeks," Tobias noted, adjusting the heavy tool belt on his hip. He turned around and walked back to his battered blue truck, filled with roofing nails and salvaged asphalt shingles. He carried the heavy equipment across the yard with the steady, practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire life working with his hands, leaning the tall ladder securely against the side of the house. "I do not have the funds to pay you for your labor, sir," Ruth said clearly, her voice maintaining its steady, dignified tone. Tobias paused on the first rung of the ladder. He looked over his shoulder. "I didn't ask for your money, ma'am. I have driven past this decaying, broken house every day for 40 years, watching it die a slow, miserable death, while the county bureaucrats sat in their air-conditioned offices doing absolutely nothing. Seeing someone finally fighting to save it is payment enough for me." Without another word, Tobias climbed up onto the dangerous sloping roof. For the next 5 hours, the silence of the abandoned property was broken only by the rhythmic, overlapping sounds of two people engaged in desperate saving labor. The heavy thud of Ruth's hammer inside the parlor echoed in time with the sharp, rapid-fire cracking of Tobias's roofing hammer above. They worked in a synchronized, unspoken harmony. Two strangers bound together by a shared respect for the immense dignity of hard, honest work and the preservation of history. By late afternoon, the gaping, charred hole in the roof had been securely covered, wrapped tight against the elements, saving the historic oak interior from certain watery destruction.
As Tobias began packing his heavy tools away, a small silver sedan pulled slowly into the dirt driveway, parking neatly behind his old blue truck. A woman stepped out, carrying a large, heavy ceramic casserole dish wrapped in a thick, checkered cotton towel. It was Agnes, a retired school teacher who lived on a modest 5-acre farm down in the valley, a woman with a gentle face and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. A rich, savory aroma of roasted chicken, thyme, and warm potatoes drifted across the yard, a smell so overwhelmingly wonderful that it made Ruth's stomach clench with sudden, sharp hunger. I saw Tobias's truck, and I figured a project of this magnitude requires proper fuel, Agnes said warmly, climbing the steps and placing the heavy dish onto a relatively clean section of the porch railing. You cannot rebuild a fortress on dry crackers and well water. Ruth looked at the steaming food. Her throat felt tight. She had spent 45 years cooking massive, elaborate meals for a family that had ultimately discarded her like garbage, constantly demanding more and offering nothing but complaints in return. Now, here in the middle of absolute ruin, a complete stranger had taken the time to stand over a hot stove and bring her warmth, sustenance, and a profound, wordless respect. Ruth whispered, her voice incredibly soft. Agnes reached out and gently patted Ruth's bandaged, trembling hand. She looked past the tired, dirty woman, her eyes wandering over the newly supported porch, the open, light-filled windows, and the secure, patched roof Tobias had masterfully patched. "You have done impossible work today," Agnes said softly. "This house has been waiting for someone like you for a very long time." The sun began its final descent, painting the sweeping Tennessee sky in brilliant, fiery shades of orange, deep violet, and bruised purple. Tobias and Agnes drove away, leaving Ruth alone once more in the immense, creeping shadows of the property. The temperature dropped rapidly, falling back into the low 40s, but Ruth did not feel the bitter, biting cold. Her body was utterly exhausted, pushed far beyond the normal limits of human endurance, but her spirit burned with a bright, steady, and unquenchable fire. She ate the warm, delicious food in the silence of the grand parlor, sitting on the floor surrounded by the ghosts of the past. She had survived the day. She picked up her heavy flashlight and turned the beam toward the colossal brick fireplace dominating the kitchen. The warmth of Agnes's meal had given her a secondary surge of energy, a restless, driving need to continue the momentum she had built. Tomorrow, she planned to begin scraping away the damaged, smoke-stained plaster that coated the walls surrounding the massive stone hearth. She walked over to the tower and chimney, running her bandaged fingers lightly over the rough, uneven surface of the wall, feeling the deep structural grooves hidden beneath a century of neglect. She closed her eyes, feeling the history vibrate through the stone. The house was slowly coming back to life under her bleeding, blistered hands, a testament to her unyielding, stoic labor. But the true reward for her incredible patience was not going to be found in the newly stabilized floorboards, the clear, sweeping views from the open windows, or the secure, watertight roof Tobias had masterfully patched. The true reward was waiting for her in the shadows. It was a secret buried deep within the architecture itself, resting silently right behind that cracked, crumbling layer of ancient plaster,
waiting for the final, shattering blow of a heavy iron hammer.
The afternoon sun hung low in the western sky, casting long, dusty beams of golden light through the newly opened windows of the kitchen. The air was thick with the chalky, suffocating smell of pulverized plaster and decades of undisturbed dirt. Ruth stood beside the colossal brick fireplace, her face smeared with gray dust, her breathing heavy and rhythmic. She held a block of coarse sandpaper in her right hand, dragging it firmly back and forth across the damaged, smoke-stained wall. Her muscles screamed. She ignored them completely. She was smoothing the rough, cracked surface, preparing the historic bones of the house for a fresh coat of lime wash. As her hand moved down the wall, sweeping in wide, exhausting arcs, her blistered palm caught on something strange. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible ridge hidden beneath the thick layers of peeling wallpaper and cheap modern spackle. She stopped. She ran her bare fingertips over the plaster. It was not a natural fracture caused by the settling of the foundation or the destructive heat of the fire. Natural cracks spider-webbed outwards, jagged and chaotic, following the path of least resistance through the brittle materials. This was a perfectly straight, razor-sharp vertical line, measuring exactly 1/4 of an inch wide. She traced it downward. It ran straight from the height of her knees, extending perfectly upward past the top of her head, disappearing into the heavy crown molding near the 10-foot ceiling. It was a seam. Someone had gone to extraordinary, meticulous lengths to seamlessly blend a hidden door into the solid wall. Ruth stepped back, her eyes narrowing in the dimming light as she processed the deliberate, masterful deception. She picked up her heavy iron hammer and a rusted flathead screwdriver from her tool bucket. Placing the edge of the screwdriver against the top of the seam, she struck the handle with a sharp, controlled blow. The plaster shattered. A large chunk of white dust fell to the floor, revealing a dark, rich surface underneath. She struck the wall again and then again, working with a relentless mechanical efficiency, tearing away the false skin of the room. Beneath the heavy layers of disguise, she did not find empty air or rotting wooden lath. She found solid, polished walnut. It was a magnificent, perfectly preserved built-in cabinet, crafted from beautiful, dark wood that had not seen the light of day in over a century. The door possessed no handle, only a small hidden depression along the edge, designed to be opened with the absolute minimum of force. Ruth slipped her fingers into the groove and pulled. The heavy walnut door swung open on silent, well-oiled brass hinges, revealing a dark, deep cavity carved directly into the thick, protective stone of the chimney breast. The air inside smelled of cedar and thyme. She aimed her heavy plastic flashlight into the darkness. Resting on 3 sturdy wooden shelves were several large, bulky bundles wrapped tightly in thick oilcloth canvas, secured with heavy hemp rope. Ruth reached in, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming, heavy weight of history resting suddenly upon her shoulders. She carried the bundles to the center of the room. She sat on the hard floorboards. With slow, deliberate movements, she untied the heavy ropes, peeling back the stiff, decaying canvas. Inside the first bundle, nestled in protective layers of dry straw, were exactly 23 pieces of flawless 19th century handcrafted ceramics. There were massive, deep blue glazed pitchers, delicate porcelain teacups painted with vibrant, unfading floral patterns, and heavy stoneware crocks bearing the distinct pressed maker marks of master artisans long dead. They were pristine. They were untouched by the fire and the rot. The second bundle yielded a dozen hand-blown glass bottles, their surfaces shimmering with an oily, iridescent sheen, varying in color from deep amber to a rich, brilliant emerald green. But it was the third, heaviest bundle that made Ruth's breath catch in her throat. She untied the final knot, opening a thick leather pouch that clinked with a dense, heavy metallic sound.
She poured the contents onto the floor. Over 60 silver and gold coins spilled out, catching the light in a dazzling, blinding cascade. Ruth picked one up, wiping the tarnish away with her thumb, revealing dates stamped clearly into the heavy metal. They ranged from the 1820s to the 1880s, rare, uncirculated currency that felt incredibly heavy and significant in her palm. Finally, at the very bottom of the hidden cabinet, she found a small, worn, leather-bound diary. The leather was cracked and dry, the pages brittle and yellowed with immense age. Ruth opened the cover with extreme care. The ink was faded to a pale brown, written in elegant, sweeping cursive handwriting. She squinted in the dying light, reading the beautiful script on the very first page. I, Elias Greer, in the year of our Lord 1888, do hereby seal this vault. I leave the fruits of my labor hidden within the stone, protected from the greedy, careless hands of my own blood. May this wealth remain in the dark until it is found by the right person, one who will not tear this house down for profit, but will bleed and sweat to heal its broken bones. A profound, heavy silence filled the ruined kitchen. Ruth did not cry. She simply closed the book, running her calloused, blistered hand over the worn leather cover, feeling an intense, transcendent connection to a man she had never met, a man who understood the exact same betrayal and the exact same fierce, protective love for this structure. The universe had not abandoned her to the dirt. It had guided her here, rewarding her stoic endurance with a treasure deliberately hidden from the very type of greedy, grasping people who had just thrown her away. The 19th century prophecy had been fulfilled, but the true monetary value of this extraordinary historical hoard was so staggering, so utterly beyond anything she could have ever imagined, that even the stoic, unbreakable Ruth Sterling would find herself holding her breath when the appraiser finally lowered his heavy magnifying glass. Dr. Arthur drove down from Nashville on a Tuesday afternoon, navigating his polished black sedan carefully over the deeply rutted gravel of Dust Mill Road. He was a man of absolute precision, carrying heavy leather cases filled with jeweler's loupes, soft cotton gloves, and thick reference books. For 4 agonizingly slow hours, the silence in the ruined kitchen was profound. He did not speak. He barely breathed. Sitting at a makeshift table fashioned from a reclaimed door resting on 2 wooden sawhorses, the leading antique appraiser worked with methodical, reverent care. He turned the heavy blue pictures under the bright beam of a halogen worklight, tracing the unblemished glazes with his gloved fingertips. He examined the 80 heavy silver and gold coins one by one, holding them up to the light, noting the pristine strikes and the complete lack of wear on the ridges. Finally, he read the fragile pages of Elias Greer's diary, turning the brittle paper with the utmost delicacy. Ruth sat by the hearth. She waited in absolute stillness. Finally, Dr. Arthur removed his thick eyeglasses and closed his leather-bound notebook with a soft, definitive thud. The sound seemed to echo off the high plaster walls, hanging in the dusty air like a gavel strike. "Mrs. Sterling," Dr. Arthur began softly, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed excitement, "in my entire 30-year career, I have never seen a private collection of this magnitude perfectly preserved in a residential setting. The ceramics are flawless, representing true museum-quality pieces that collectors will fight viciously to acquire. The coins are uncirculated rarities from a highly coveted era of American minting." He paused, taking a slow, deep breath. "And the diary is a priceless, verified historical artifact documenting the post-war reconstruction of Tennessee," he continued, looking directly into Ruth's calm eyes. The conservative auction estimate for the physical objects alone is roughly $340,000. If a bidding war ensues among private collectors, this entire collection could easily command upwards of $480,000. The room stopped. The air grew incredibly heavy. Ruth sat perfectly still in the middle of her $9 ruin. She did not gasp, she did not jump up, nor did she let out a cry of victory. She simply folded her calloused, blistered hands over her knees, feeling the immense, grounding weight of the limestone foundation beneath her feet. 45 years of silent servitude, of being cast aside for a measly $214, had culminated in this staggering, monumental validation of her worth. "I understand," Ruth replied quietly, her voice as steady as the oak beams holding up the roof above them. "Please begin the process of contacting the auction houses, Doctor." It was a victory of profound, quiet dignity. However, in a small, interconnected county like Harland, a secret of that sheer magnitude could not stay buried in the thick pine forests for long. A careless whisper from a junior clerk at the appraisal firm drifted across state lines, traveling swiftly over the telephone wires until it reached the manicured suburbs where the greedy and the desperate dwelled. Desmond and Priscilla heard the rumors. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The absolute junk they had so maliciously forced upon their aging stepmother was actually a golden vault. The $47,000 and the $62,000 they had stolen now felt like bitter, worthless pocket change compared to a $500,000 windfall. They wanted it back. They needed it back. News of the massive, staggering fortune spread like a raging wildfire through the dry brush, and the very same treacherous people who had laughed at her poverty abruptly turned their expensive cars around, racing furiously toward the dirt roads of Harlan County with a desperate, filthy scheme already brewing in their dark minds.
The heavy oak doors of the Harlan County Courthouse swung open, admitting a rush of humid 85-degree Fahrenheit summer air into the sterile, air-conditioned courtroom. Desmond and Priscilla marched down the center aisle, their footsteps echoing sharply against the polished marble floor. They were flanked by a team of 3 expensive city lawyers carrying thick leather briefcases, moving with the aggressive, frantic energy of scavengers desperate to reclaim a carcass they had foolishly abandoned. They smelled the money, and it drove them mad. Desmond wore a custom-tailored suit that squeezed his heavy frame, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool room. Priscilla wore a sharp, dark dress and clutched a designer handbag that cost more than Ruth's entire original bank balance of $214. They did not look like mourning children. They looked like predators. Ruth sat perfectly still at the defense table. She did not turn around. She wore a simple, faded navy blue dress she had washed by hand in a galvanized steel tub. Her gray hair pulled back into a severe, uncompromising bun. Beside her sat Thaddeus, the elderly lawyer who had presided over the original bidder settlement. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp, missing absolutely nothing. Judge Ruth Sterling, a formidable woman with a face carved from the same uncompromising stone as the courthouse walls, struck her heavy wooden gavel. The sharp, cracking sound demanded absolute silence from the room. "We are here to review an emergency injunction filed by the plaintiffs demanding an immediate freeze and subsequent redistribution of assets discovered at 22 Dust Mill Road," Judge Sterling announced, her voice flat and devoid of any warmth. "Counsel for the plaintiffs, you may proceed." A tall, slick lawyer with a silk tie stepped up to the wooden podium, standing exactly 10 feet away from the judge's towering bench. "Your Honor,
"We are dealing with a profound, calculated deception," the lawyer began, his voice ringing with false, theatrical outrage. The defendant, Ruth Sterling, manipulated a frail, dying man into granting her the deed to a property she knew secretly housed a fortune, valued at nearly $500,000. Priscilla nodded vigorously. Desmond crossed his heavy arms. "My clients accepted a modest inheritance of $47,000 and $62,000, believing it was the entirety of the liquid estate," the slick lawyer continued, pacing slowly across the 3-yard stretch of carpet. "We assert that the antiquities found behind the plaster were undisclosed inherited assets belonging to the late patriarch, and therefore must be divided equally among his rightful blood heirs." It was a filthy, shameless lie. Ruth felt a slow, heavy wave of disgust wash over her, but her face remained a mask of perfect, impenetrable calm. They had mocked her. They had laughed in her face and thrown her out onto the street to freeze in her car, entirely convinced the property was worthless. Now that she had bled over the broken glass, dragged 80-pound timbers through the dirt, and breathed in the suffocating dust to resurrect the ruins, they suddenly wanted to be family again. Judge Daring looked down at Thaddeus. "Does the defense have a response to these grave accusations?" Judge Daring asked sharply. Thaddeus stood up slowly, his joints popping in the quiet room. He did not pace. He did not raise his voice or engage in the dramatic, sweeping theatrics of the expensive city lawyer. He simply reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a single, perfectly preserved sheet of heavy parchment paper. "We do not need to argue, Your Honor," Thaddeus stated calmly, his gravelly voice carrying a quiet, devastating weight. He handed the document to the court bailiff, a large man weighing well over 200 pounds, who carried it quickly up to the high wooden bench. "What you are holding is a legally binding, sworn affidavit executed simultaneously with the original property transfer. It was drafted at the specific, aggressive insistence of Desmond and Priscilla themselves. They were so terrified that the derelict property might harbor hidden debts, toxic waste, or back taxes that they demanded a complete, absolute severance of all liability." Desmond's face suddenly went entirely pale. Priscilla stopped breathing. "If you look at paragraph 4, subsection B," Thaddeus continued, pointing a long, bony finger toward the document, "it clearly states that the grantee, Ruth Sterling, assumes total, unmitigated ownership of the land, the structures, and, I quote directly from the text, any contents within, known or unknown, in perpetuity, abandoning any and all future claims by the estate." Thaddeus turned his head. He looked directly at Desmond. "You forced her to sign it so you would not have to pay for the demolition order," Thaddeus said quietly, letting the absolute truth ring through the silent room. Judge Daring adjusted her reading glasses, her eyes scanning the precise legal text. The silence in the courtroom stretched for a full, agonizing minute. The air grew thick, suffocating the greedy plaintiffs who suddenly realized they were completely, legally trapped by their own immense selfishness. The judge lowered the paper. Her expression was terrifying. "This document is ironclad," Judge Daring stated coldly, her voice echoing like thunder across the mahogany room. "The plaintiffs explicitly forfeited all rights to this property and its contents, known or unknown. You threw this woman away with exactly $214 to her name, forcing her to inhabit a condemned ruin. Now you come into my courtroom attempting to steal the fruits of her agonizing labor because your own greed blinded you to the true value of what you discarded." She raised her heavy wooden gavel. "This is a frivolous, insulting abuse of the legal system," Judge Daring reprimanded fiercely, staring down at the city lawyers who were now hastily packing their expensive briefcases. The emergency injunction is entirely denied. This case is dismissed with extreme prejudice. If I see you in my courtroom regarding this matter, I will sanction your legal team for wasting municipal resources. The gavel fell with a loud, violent crack. It was over. Ruth did not smile. She did not taunt them. She simply stood up, smoothing the front of her handmade, faded dress, retaining the immense, towering dignity that had carried her through 45 years of silent endurance. She turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors, her worn leather boots clicking softly against the marble floor. Desmond and Priscilla remained frozen at the plaintiff's table. They were completely broken, stripped of their arrogance and publicly exposed as the greedy, heartless fools they truly were. They hung their heads in profound, bitter humiliation, unable to speak, unable to look the gallery in the eye, crushed under the devastating, crushing weight of their own terrible karma. They dragged their feet. They walked in total shame. Those who betray the loyal eventually drown in the bitter waters of their own making, forced to retreat into the shadows of their hollow, meaningless lives. They left behind a woman who had never once compromised her soul, a woman who now possessed the absolute freedom to return to her limestone fortress, where she was finally ready to forge a brilliant, spectacular new dawn from the very ashes they had left her to die in.
The transition from ruin to sanctuary was not a sudden magical occurrence, but a slow, methodical march of immense, unyielding labor. Ruth Sterling traveled back and forth to the secure, climate-controlled vaults in Nashville over the following weeks, overseeing the careful, meticulous transfer of Elias Greer's forgotten legacy into the hands of preservationists and museum curators. She did not hoard the wealth or spend it on frivolous, hollow luxuries like the foolish people who had tried to destroy her. After the final, heavy gavel fell at the private auction, the bank transfer was cleared with clinical, absolute precision. The final sum was exactly $371,000. She was finally safe. Ruth returned to number 22 Dust Mill Road with a clear, unwavering vision for the sprawling 2-acre property. She hired Tobias on a permanent, generous retainer, allowing the weathered, skilled carpenter to assemble a small, dedicated crew of local tradesmen who deeply respected the historic, enduring bones of the limestone fortress. Together they ripped away the rot and the decay, replacing the burned rafters with solid, heavy beams of old-growth oak and thick, unyielding heart pine. The deafening roar of chainsaws and the heavy, rhythmic thumping of iron hammers filled the air from sunrise to sunset, echoing across the valley as a beautiful, industrial symphony of pure resurrection. They worked tirelessly. The county officially removed the demolition order. By the time the warm, gentle winds of spring finally swept through Harlan County, pushing the afternoon temperature up to a comfortable 72 degrees Fahrenheit, the transformation was entirely complete. The towering, grand farmhouse stood proud and magnificent against the sweeping blue horizon, stripped of its tragic blackened past and wrapped in a fresh, pristine coat of brilliant white lime wash. A newly built, sturdy fence, crafted from sweet-smelling cedar, stretched along the property line, guarding the estate with a quiet, dignified strength. Ruth stood quietly on the wide, perfectly leveled wraparound porch. The boards did not groan. She rested her calloused, permanently scarred hands upon the smooth, newly sanded wood of the front railing. A thin, delicate ribbon of white wood smoke drifted lazily from the colossal brick chimney, carrying the comforting, earthy scent of burning pine needles into the fading, golden afternoon sky. She took a slow, deep breath, filling her lungs with the clean, fresh air, feeling an immense, transcendent wave of peace settle deep within her tired, aching bones. She was no longer a discarded servant, nor was she a victim of the greedy, heartless world that had tried to bury her alive in a shallow, forgotten grave. She was completely free. She looked out over the vast, vibrant green landscape, watching the brilliant orange sun dip slowly below the towering ancient pines. Her spirit was anchored as firmly to the earth as the massive, immovable limestone blocks resting silently beneath her feet. From a $9 pile of absolute garbage actively rejected by the entire world, this magnificent, towering estate had proven a profound, undeniable truth. Your true value is never determined by the shallow things that hollow, greedy people attempt to strip away from you, but rather by the quiet, unbreakable iron strength within your own soul that allows you to slowly, painstakingly rebuild your life from the ashes of absolute ruin.